Hello everyone. Today we're talking about chapter 18, part 1. I split this chapter into two sections. The first one mainly covers the Renaissance. So this whole chapter is Renaissance and Baroque. The second part covers Mannerism, Baroque, and a little bit of Eastern art. So today we're talking about Renaissance art. In this case, we're talking a little bit more in depth about individual artists, so it's a good idea to write keywords or artists and then some of the factors that contributed to their artworks and their development as an artist and their contributions to the Renaissance. Reminder, this week there is a movie review due on Friday. The handout, the assignment is listed on Schoology. And just a couple of thoughts. First of all, make sure you really pick a film that you enjoy, that you want to watch, as opposed to one that you feel like you're being forced to watch. One of the artists that has a documentary that you can watch is The Artist is Present, about the artist Marina Abramović, who I showed you that short clip. Remember her reuniting with her former partner, Ulay. That's a possibility. There's one called Wasteland that is about a guy who works in the largest dump in the world in Rio and works with these catadors or pickers to make large works of art that he then photographs. And then another one, Cutie and the Boxer, is this Japanese artist who literally uses like boxing gloves to punch the paint onto the canvas. So watch the trailers first, pick the one that you think you really identify with, and remember, I just want your perspective, not a typical kind of movie review, but your perspective on the film and how it relates to course content and sort of the context of what we've talked about this semester. Use vocab when appropriate and just really describe the artwork and the artists that you see. All right, so today talking about Renaissance art, chapter 18. Do you know these guys? Recognize them? It's the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, right? Why am I showing you this? Well, if you think about it, like Master Splinter taught these young turtles art history as they, had this cosmic ooze that turned them into mutants and warriors, and he gave them names of Renaissance. So you have Donatello, Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo. We'll talk about all these guys today. And on the right, I love this street art here where you have the actual, depictions of these Renaissance artists like Leonardo da Vinci, and then you have the famous turtle masks over top, Raphael, Michelangelo, Donatello. So kind of a funny image, but this is where we think about the Renaissance and how much of an impact they have on Western history, Western trajectory, but also become household names. These are really kind of famous, heavy hitter artists. So first of all, Renaissance comes after this period of the Black Plague, the bubonic plague that wiped out, decimated Europe's population. Almost half of the population died. There was part of cities in Italy like Florence where nearly 60% of the population was wiped out over the course of about a month. And so after this period in the 15th century, people were feeling pretty good about themselves that they survived. They thought that it was perhaps divinely granted. You kind of look around in the ashes, and ironically, I mean, we can kind of relate today in terms of like plague and disease and things being spread like this pandemic of the coronavirus, that sometimes people maybe think that someone is spared or someone else is a victim because of their behavior or because of who they are, right? So the Renaissance is born right after this period. And Renaissance is from the Italian Rinascita, which means Renaissance, which means rebirth, right? So what happened was there was this rebirth in culture. So they studied classical texts. They studied, some of those Roman and Greek sculptures that we looked at in the ancient art section, that, the Romans were copying those Greek sculptures. Well, those have been buried and just kind of lost. They were relics. They were in ruin. And artists like Michelangelo during the Renaissance started to discover those and dig those up. So those old Greek and Roman sculptures now inspired the Renaissance, and they made their work, and we'll see this with Michelangelo, made their work look like these ancient classical, so Renaissance, and also the text, so poets like Petrarch and Dante, like Dante's Inferno, they were studying sort of classical texts like the ancient Greek texts, philosophical, and thinking about Greek gods and Roman gods. But they also wrote in their native tongue, in the language of Italian. So there was this sort of like emphasis on this local and regional culture, but then studying the ancient and classical texts and art as well. So one of the first things that we look at is this Very Rich Hours by Duke de Berry here. This image, the book shows it on page 445. And if we were to compare this to illuminated manuscripts, so this is a book, this is a study, this is a book of prayers, it's a book of hours. And also, if you notice at the top, if you kind of like start to dissect and unravel what this image is, this was in the Book of Hours or Book of Prayers. So this would have been the Duke, who would have been very wealthy, paid someone to make this. And this was his sort of devotional Bible, where he would study things, different parts of the Bible or prayers throughout the year. So hence the zodiac at the top and the different parts of the calendar. So each part of the calendar would represent a different part of the year. And so the image would relate to that particular part. And they're all related to what the Duke would have been familiar with and his kind of like life. So if we compare this to another illuminated manuscript like the Book of Kells that we saw in the Age of Faith, they were much more crude, right? They were much more stylistic. And they weren't crude because they didn't know how to make art. They chose to do that. So here in the Renaissance now, we have another emphasis on classical art, but making figures look naturalistic. You can see there's even shadows cast. Look at the depth and the detail here. This is much more elaborate and ornate and detailed, even though it's small, than the predecessors in illuminated manuscripts. So this kind of kickstarts the Renaissance and an emphasis on the figure and making things look realistic, representational, and naturalistic. It's really interesting because you kind of see different aspects of daily life here. Someone's hunting, right? You see someone's hunting here. You see people in the river here, merchants delivering goods, a farmer here, someone sowing and casting out seeds. So it's this aspect of people and their involvement. So representing something that is actually in the landscape and making it look true to the local topography. Here's Donatello. Donatello on the left, his sculpture of David. This is one of the most influential things. So if you're thinking about what starts the Renaissance, a lot of people point to, remember those doors of the Florence Baptistry that we looked at, that very famous competition. Who was the competition between? Ghiberti and Brunelleschi, right? Remember that? And then who went on to win? That's right, it was Ghiberti. He did the doors. This is right before the Renaissance. Well, who was his student? Ghiberti taught Donatello. You see me mean mugging in front of Donatello's David. This is a great sculpture. Here we see it again. It's here. And I didn't put in the image, but just over here, just past where Donatello's David is, are those actual quatrefoil studies, those Sacrifice of Isaac panels that we looked at before. Remember, we saw that competition. Who should have won, Ghiberti or Brunelleschi? A lot of you thought Brunelleschi, but Ghiberti actually won. Well, it's in this museum, the Bargello. And what's amazing about this museum is not a lot of people go. You see me here on the left here. So you have this huge room, and it's in this old prison. And you get these artworks to yourself, essentially, because it's not as well traveled as, say, the Uffizi or the Louvre. So you can get really, really close to these sculptures. And see them up close, and you can see those panels, the Sacrifice of Isaac panels that we looked at. Well, why is this sculpture so important? We'll get back to that in a minute, but I wanted to mention, so Ghiberti, he was, if you think about the start of the Renaissance, one of those things that started it was the doors of the Florence Baptistry, that competition between Ghiberti and Brunelleschi. Ghiberti teaches Donatello his techniques of the lost wax process, which enables him to make this sculpture of David, right? Biblical David, the same figure that Michelangelo carves later. So this is bronze. Well, what does Brunelleschi wind up doing when he loses the competition to the doors of the Florence Baptistery? Not chump change. He actually wins the competition to put the dome on the Florence Cathedral. This isn't in the book, but I think this is really, the book talks about it, but doesn't show this image. It's really important to notice that he is an innovator, an inventor. He was trained as a goldsmith, but yet he knew engineering because working on those clocks, those small clock pieces, he understood engineering. Donatello was friends with Brunelleschi. They actually traveled, they did the sort of gentleman's tour, and they traveled to Rome together. It was a short trip from Florence, and they studied the ancient architecture and ruins and sculptures, and they came back to Florence with this idea of let's resurrect classical art. Instead of looking back at what happened during the medieval era, like those flying buttresses and Gothic architecture and Romanesque architecture, let's make a whole new style of architecture embedded with these ideas of the Renaissance, rebirth, humanism at the center, but let's base it on classical architecture. So it's interesting, the dome of the Florence Cathedral was a really challenging engineering feat. This was the largest dome of its time in the 15th century. This building had already been finished, and it was, this church existed for about 100 years without an actual dome. They figured by the time they got done building it, they would figure out a way to make a dome. Well, that wasn't the case. And it also slowed down because of the plague. This was being built during the plague. So when the plague was finished, it's like, haha, let's do this and let's really master it now. We have to have a competition. The reason why it was such a challenging engineering project is because most domes are built on the top of a round or a square, like when we think about Justinian's Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, square base, right? Square drum, and then you have the pendentives that go up to a circular base. Or a circle itself. It's easy to put a circle on top of another circle. Well, if you think about a dome as being a circle, how do you put that on an octagon base? A polygon with 8 sides, and to think about making that go up to a dome. So Brunelleschi won this competition. He had never done anything with architecture before. It's huge. It's really a marvel, an architectural feat, and how he figured out how to do this. But basically, he made 2 domes, one inside the other, and the inside one supports the outer one. And if you notice, these are all individual kind of like little sections, almost like as you peel an onion or peel an orange and those little sections come out. And what was also really clever about this, not only did he design and help build the dome on the Florence Cathedral, but he also had to come up with all of the machines and the mechanism, like the scaffolding. So each time they would build a successive layer, they would build another scaffolding that would reach out so they could keep making the curve of the dome. He also came up with pulley systems, and actually if you climb, which you can do, you can climb, which I've done, and it's beautiful, you can climb to the top of Brunelleschi's dome. Actually, this past May, I took students there, and it was my birthday, the day that we climbed to the top. It was raining, and it was kind of a shitty day, but we climbed to the top of Brunelleschi's dome. It's like 300 feet up. It's like 300 steps to the top. And when you get to the top, it's kind of like, oh, that was such hard work. It's you know, it's really claustrophobic. You kind of have to, as the dome curves, the stairway curves and gets smaller and smaller. If you're claustrophobic, you might not want to do it. When we get to the top, it's raining. You can't see all that great, but then everyone's saying me happy birthday. All the students saying that was really special. That's like a special memory for me. So this is something you can do. You can climb to the top of the dome here, and you can look out over Florence. So this is a really iconic building. It helped kickstart the Renaissance as well. This became sort of a foundational building block for what architecture would look like. So Brunelleschi also did something else that I want you to write down. Brunelleschi, dome, also known as the Duomo, the Florence Cathedral, but he also invented linear perspective. It's really interesting. And one of the ways that he tested out this linear perspective was he took a canvas and put a hole in it, and he drew the Florence Baptistry, which is right across from here. This is actually the Florence Baptistry right here, where the gates that Ghiberti designed are in the front of those. So he would stand on the steps of the Florence Cathedral looking out at the Florence Baptistry, and he had this painting using linear perspective of the Florence Baptistry, and it had a hole in it. And what he would do is he would take people to the steps of the Florence Cathedral, and he'd say, look at my canvas of the baptistry across the street. And then he'd say, now look through the hole. And it would be, he'd have the painting backwards. He'd say, now look through the hole, and he'd hold up a mirror, and they'd see the painting. Move the mirror, they'd see the Florence Baptistry. Put the mirror back, they'd see the painting. It would make people he'd say I hope you got a clean pair of underwear because I'm gonna make you shit your pants. This is so crazy, right? It would blow their mind. It was like the CG of its day. Linear perspective, right? So Brunelleschi develops linear perspective. These are those gates of paradise. So there's a couple of factors. The lost wax process, which we talked about before. You mold something first. You have a clay core. You have wax over top of that. And then you build a frame around it. When you pour in the molten bronze, it melts out the wax and it replaces where the wax was. So these are Ghiberti's doors, the gates of paradise, which actually Michelangelo nicknamed them. Here we see a detail of these. These are all scenes from the Bible. And this is actually a portrait of Ghiberti. He put all of these saints and patrons in there, but he also included a self-portrait. So this is actually pretty cool. We get to see what Ghiberti looked like. So Ghiberti taught Donatello, and Donatello uses that process of the lost wax process to make this large-scale nude of David. So this was the first full-scale sculpture since antiquity, since classical period. So that means there hadn't been sculptures made on this scale, freestanding, for 1,000 years, right? Really interesting to think about that because you just kind of take that for granted, right? That sculpture sort of already exists and is always around us. But there was a long period during the medieval era where people were not making large-scale sculpture. And if they were making sculpture, it was attached to a building. It was in a niche, in a church. It wasn't in the round. It wasn't freestanding. Notice his pose. We see David here, biblical David, right? What does David do? He kills Goliath. Where do we see the indication of this biblical story? Well, here, he's actually standing on the beheaded head, the decapitated head of Goliath. Here he's wearing a shepherd's hat, which actually would have been more common during the era of the Renaissance than it was in biblical time. And he's holding a sword, and then he has the stone here. So it's kind of like a before and after, as it were, because this is the stone that he would have used with his slingshot. You can see he's kind of hiding it here. You see the stone, you see the sword, and you see him standing on the head here. This is an emphasis on humanism, right? Humanism is this idea, the belief in the unique value of each person, but it's also a classical nod to Plato and Platonic ideals. During the Greek era and Plato, they believed that young male bodies were really beautiful. You would see in Greek sculptures, you would see nude males, but you would rarely see nude females. They believed that the male was perfect and ideal and beautiful. So there's sort of this Renaissance return to the ancient Greek sculptural ideals. This was done using the lost wax process. In addition to the symbolism of this being about David, and David later, being a young shepherd, the only one with enough courage and heroism to take on Goliath, right? It's like the power of the individual. Not only that, though, but he later becomes a king. So in a way, this is not just about David. This sculpture is about Florence, because Florence was able to fend off their enemies, and they saw that as being God-granted. Siena and neighboring republics, this is when you had city-states throughout. It wasn't Italy at the time. It was just a bunch of papal states or independent city-states. And so Florence was able to fend off its enemies and rise up as sort of victorious. So they used David as symbolism, as their sort of like mascot of their heroic fending off of their enemies, just like David fended off Goliath. They were bigger and better. They should have lost, but here they won, right? So this is 5'2", very beautiful sculpture. Look at the pose. Do you remember what that pose is called? Right? The relaxed hip, the kind of like bent shoulders, relaxed hip, weight on one leg, the other leg's relaxed. Contrapposto. So we see that contrapposto return from this ancient ideal. So they were definitely studying ancient Roman and Greek sculptures. The early Renaissance, like I mentioned, humanism was a belief in the unique value of each person. The poet Petrarch developed this idea. He also wrote in Italian. And Donatello's David was the first life-size nude sculpture since antiquity, rendered in contrapposto at classical posing. Masaccio was a friend of Donatello and Brunelleschi. Remember, Donatello and Brunelleschi were friends. Masaccio, though, was trained by both of those artists, but he was much younger. And this painting isn't in the book. They show Masaccio's tribute money instead. I'll show you that one. This is a really influential painting. This is a significant painting. It's in the Santa Maria Novella in Florence. It's a beautiful church. If you get off the train station in Florence, it's the very first church that you'll see. Take a tour of it. It's beautiful. And you see a really nice crucifix by Giotto, and you see this beautiful fresco painted on the wall by Masaccio. It's the first painting, and you make note of this, first painting that shows linear perspective. Where do we see linear perspective? Well, we see the use of orthogonals and foreshortening, receding lines here in this kind of architectural space. Again, this is like the CG of its day. This was like if you put on those glasses and go to the movies and you see a 3D film. This is just like mind-boggling. You would go into church and think like there's this space on the wall and there's this like hallway behind it. It looks like Christ is really here because of this use of linear perspective. First time we see it in a painting because he was friends with Brunelleschi. Remember, Brunelleschi had that illusion that he showed how to use linear perspective. This is the first time we see it actually used in an artwork. And so this is the Holy Trinity. We see the Holy Trinity because if you look close, here's God, right? He has his halo. Here's the Holy Spirit represented by a dove, and here's Christ on the cross with the Virgin and St. John, and then the donors, the people who paid for this painting to be made. And then this really curious thing at the bottom, which was hidden for a long time. They had part of a wall covering this, but this skeleton, which is called a memento mori. It's a reminder of our life is short, it's fleeting. And above there, in Latin, is an inscription. And it's a skeleton telling us, this is a sort of cautionary tale. This is this message that the skeleton painted by Masaccio wants to tell us. That looks very three-dimensional, right? And it even comes out from the wall using linear perspective. And the inscription says, I once was what you are, and what I am, a skeleton, you will become, right? So the idea is if you put yourself at the feet of Christ, you can find salvation. Even though life is fleeting and will become a corpse, that we can have eternal life if we believe in Christ. So it's a really interesting metaphor and symbolism, very beautiful and important painting in the early Renaissance. Here you can see a use of this single point linear perspective where everything converges down to that one point. This is another painting by Masaccio. I'll just briefly mention a couple of factors from it. This is actually Christ talking to St. Peter and the rest of the apostles. And St. Peter says, why should we pay Rome if we are owed, if our salvation is indebted to you and to God, why should we pay our taxes to the Romans? We're not indebted to them, we're indebted to you. And Christ said, don't worry, I will provide you the funds. So here he's telling St. Peter, go look in a fish. And if you look in this fish, you will find in its mouth the money to be able to pay the taxpayer. So here he's pointing out to St. Peter where to go. Here we see St. Peter reaching into the water and getting a coin out of the fish's mouth. You can see he's cast off his robe here. And then here is St. Peter again talking to the tax collector and saying, here's your money. Don't worry about how I got it. I'm paying you. And if you want to see this keep coming, trust me, and I just as I trust Christ. Right? So it's interesting telling of narrative. It uses linear perspective. Masaccio learned this from his buddy Brunelleschi. And it's also very interesting because it shows us a passing of time. This narrative happens. It's sort of like a before, a during, and an after, right? We see this is the now, this is the before, and this is the later, which is really sort of interesting if you think about a layering of time onto one scene. If we compare this to what's happening, so those are things that are happening in the early Renaissance in Italy. At the same time, there are artists doing similar things in the north. And some of these artists later, like Da Vinci, was influenced by these northern Renaissance artists. And this is the artist Roger van der Weyden. And his work is very influenced by the Merode altarpiece. Remember that one created by Robert Campin that had the Annunciation in the center where Gabriel is telling Mary she's pregnant. There's the little baby Jesus coming through the window. There's Joseph on one side of the triptych. This is influenced by that, where you can see here, compared to the Masaccio, there's a lot more detail. These were the first artists to use oil paint. So there's a lot more depth and blending that happens because of this, whereas these are fresco. These painters were using either tempera or fresco. They weren't using oil paint yet. So here there's a lot of detail that these artists were able to get, like Van der Weyden, but you're not seeing perspective as much, right? Here's the Campin Merode altarpiece, which we talked about before. I'm just going to show you because this happens in Belgium. This is the Northern Renaissance at the same time that Masaccio and others are kickstarting the Renaissance in the South. So the oil paintings in the North are much more dimensional and representational. Chiaroscuro, you can get a sense of shading, but they don't understand perspective. They're not friends with Brunelleschi. They haven't understood foreshortening and receding and all of that. We move next to Botticelli. So this is the artist Sandro Botticelli. He was really good friends with the Medicis, and the Medicis were this important merchant class family that was also in power in Florence, and they funded, they paid for, they commissioned for works like Donatello's David, for Botticelli's Primavera, which you've seen before. Remember, we talked about this painting, but also this painting that's in this chapter, Botticelli's Birth of Venus. This is tempera, so not oil paint. So we see there's less shading and gradation than in the Northern Renaissance counterparts, but still a lot of detail and impressive characteristics of being lifelike. What's interesting about this painting, so this is the Birth of Venus, it's both Platonic ideals because it shows Greek and Roman ideas of nature and beauty, but it's also Christian in a sense because it's Venus as the birth of her kind of place as beautiful muse in the world, but it also represents this idea of Eve, right? Think about Adam and Eve, and then she's kind of like barely covering herself. She's not doing a good job of covering her naughty bits, right? You can still see her breasts. But it's a way of kind of showing like Adam and Eve in a sense, like bringing a Christian biblical tale to its kind of classical counterparts of more of like pagan belief. So it's this interesting kind of counterpoised ideas that can coexist in this very, very beautiful painting. Painted in tempera, we can see she's about to be clothed here. If Botticelli were alive today, he would probably work for Vogue. He would probably be a fashion photographer. If you look at Vogue magazine, a lot of their poses and gesture, even this we kind of see is like contrapposto, but look at all of Botticelli's figures are always like impossibly like floating. They're lifelike, but they're also lifeless at the same time. They're larger than life. They're very big in scale as well. This painting's about 9 feet tall and 10 feet wide. So Vogue covers and a lot of fashion photography is indebted to the ideas of Botticelli. So some of those ancient ideas of beauty are being rebirthed during the Renaissance, and we still borrow from them today. You can think about like Beyonce on the cover of Vogue, which happened about a year ago. She actually used some of the same poses as the Birth of Venus from Botticelli and others. It's really interesting if you think about the study of aesthetics and beauty and where we get our ideas of beauty from. Here's me standing in front of Botticelli. I hope you get an opportunity to go to Florence at some time. If you do, there's this amazing museum called the Uffizi, and in it they have a room full of Botticellis, nothing but Botticellis. They have this painting, they have this painting, and they're huge. They're larger than life. So you can see me, a beautiful wife, Carly, and actually she just put together this puzzle that is just the face. So just this section right here of the birth of Venus. It's pretty cool. Made of these teeny tiny little pixels. Instead of like puzzle pieces, they're tiny little dots. And it's really, really cool. So this is in Florence. And this is important because we think about Botticelli's connection to the Medicis. And this woman, his muse, was actually a real woman. So if you watch the Medicis, which is this really cool show, I believe it's on HBO. I think you can watch it, stream it on Netflix as well. It talks about Florence during this era, Medici, Botticelli, and this actual woman here who was married, but Botticelli was in love with. So check that out, the Medicis. So the High Renaissance is the next movement that we talk about. It's part of the Renaissance, but it's everything sort of like ramped up on steroids. There's three major figures during the Renaissance: Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Look at how they're just such household names that you just know them by one name. Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, right? 3 out of 4 of the turtles. The other one, Donatello, came before the High Renaissance, right? So we think about how these artists were good at a lot of different things. For instance, Leonardo da Vinci, he worked for this duke, the Duke of Milan in Italy. He was born in Florence, worked in Florence for a while, went to Milan, and then later goes to France. And he primarily worked as a military engineer, which is really interesting. And he had a very restless imagination. He did a lot of poems, engineering drawings. He studied anatomy. He would carve up cadavers. This was taboo and illegal at the time. He would get the cadavers from the local morgue or from the prison. A lot of times people didn't know he was doing this, so it's kind of like under the table. And he contributed a lot of things. There was recently a heart machine that doctors had invented, and they named it the Da Vinci because they feel like doctors in the 21st century are just now catching up to the understanding that Leonardo had in the 16th century as a Renaissance artist. It's really impressive. And he said he thought he wasn't really that good at painting, and that's probably what he's best known for today. Also Raphael, and Raphael was younger than Michelangelo and Da Vinci, but he studied from both of their works, looking at them and copied some of their techniques. So we start first with Da Vinci, and he was a true Renaissance man, as I mentioned: painter, sculptor, architect, scientist, engineer, mathematician, inventor, poet, like I said before. But he said, "I'm not that good at painting." We talked about before how he wrote his text backwards and in Latin when everyone else is speaking Italian, as a way of codifying his sketchbook so that people wouldn't find it and easily steal his ideas. He invented some things that didn't exist until the 20th century, like tanks and skis, like all these really interesting things that he developed that weren't put into practice until much later. He tried to invent a flying machine. Just a lot of really interesting things. So he worked for the Duke of Milan and did a lot of building of military machines for him, like trebuchets, catapults, that sort of thing, and fortifications so that the city would not be attacked. But he's best known for likely this painting. Also The Last Supper, we looked at that painting before, where Christ and all the disciples are sitting on one side of the table, right? I told you that bad joke about, hey, it's St. Peter at the restaurant. I want a table for 26, but there's only 13 of you. Yeah, but we want to sit all on the same side, right? Have you guys seen? There's these artists that are taking all of the people out of paintings. So there's this great one of Christ on the Last Supper where all of the apostles and disciples are gone. It's just him. You should look for that. It's pretty cool. But the reason this painting is so popular is part of its quality of being enigmatic, right? It's very mysterious. She's got this sort of like half smile or smirk. She's in this what we call three-quarter pose, so not like full faced this way, but sort of turned to the side a little bit. That's called three-quarter pose. She's holding her hands in a particular way. This is a real person. The Italians call her La Gioconda, the wife of Gioconda. Gioconda was a real person. He was a Florentinian banker. And so here, this is his wife, and he commissioned Da Vinci to paint her, but he never finished it. Worked on this for 3 years. And when he died, and he was living in France in exile, when he died, the painting wasn't finished, so the French king kept it. That's why it's in the Louvre today in Paris. A lot of people think the reason why this is the most famous painting in the world is because it's Da Vinci's best painting. That's not necessarily the case. Part of the reason why this painting is so popular is because it was actually stolen, and it was missing for over a year in the Louvre at the turn of the 20th century, so like 1903, 1906, something like that. So like 400 years after it was painted. People would go to the Louvre, see it, and be like, whatever, it's a Leonardo painting. But then it disappeared, and people were like, oh my gosh, it became this like mystery, like, who stole this painting? Turns out it was this Italian dude who thought, you know what? Why did France steal this painting from Italy? This is ours. I'm going to give it back to the Italian government. For a while, they thought maybe Picasso stole it. So this huge mystery. People would actually go to the Louvre to see where the Mona Lisa was. So there was all these newspaper articles about it. So then when it goes back finally to the Louvre, everybody wants to go see it again. And it stayed that popular to this day. Actually, if you try to go see it in a room, you're going to be standing probably 60 feet away from it. You can't get more than 10 feet from it, and it's behind glass because it's a treasure. What's interesting about this painting, though, is it was much more colorful when it was painted, and it's got a lot of layers of varnish on it that have yellowed and browned over time. We know this painting should actually be much more colorful. There's actually a study of it that was painted by one of Leonardo's students, and it is bright and prismatic and really, really colorful. It's been restored and cleaned. This has not been restored. Generally, paintings will be restored every 25 to 50 years, and every 100 years they need to go through a major restoration. This one has not undergone its major 100-year restoration because people expect it to look like this. Like, it might blow their mind if they went and saw the Mona Lisa and she was really colorful and not these kind of somber brown sienna tones, right? So the reason why this is a really important painting, though, is because Mona Lisa painted in oil, right? So this is one of the first Renaissance paintings painted in oil, Italian Renaissance painted in oil as opposed to tempera or fresco. And who did Leonardo study with? Well, some of those artists in the north, like Van Eyck and Robert Campin, who did the Merode altarpiece. He looked at those works and refined the use of oil paint. He figured out a way to make it cleaner and brighter and last longer and blend. And so we call this technique smokiness. It seems to have a veil of smokiness everywhere. We call it sfumato, this Italian word for smokiness. We also see chiaroscuro, so there's no hard lines or edges anywhere. It's just all this really subtle gradation and modeling. Chiaroscuro and sfumato, or smokiness. It kind of creates this kind of veil of mistiness to it. The next artist during the High Renaissance who was really influential is the artist Michelangelo. He's known, we talked about Pietà earlier in the semester. He's really well known for this piece, David. This was nicknamed Colossus at first. Someone had started to carve David. It was this really, really big piece of marble, 14-foot slab of marble. They started to carve it, but then just got nervous with all this weight supported by these two small legs. It probably will crumble and fall apart. Only a really good artist will be able to finish carving this. So Michelangelo won the commission to turn this into David. Why David? Well, remember, this is in Florence. Just like Donatello's symbol of David to represent Florence, same idea here. This was originally going to go up on the Florence Duomo, on the side of it. But once Michelangelo finished it, you know, people said this is the best sculpture of all time, since classical times, right? And so they decided to put it on the ground instead. This was in front of the Palazzo in Florence, right next to the Uffizi. And actually, there's a copy of it to this day there. But now it's been moved inside. This is an amazing experience to go see this. A lot of people will see the copy and like take a selfie in front of it and be like, oh, I'm in front of Michelangelo's David. But that's just a copy that was done around the same time as this one. And it's smaller. The actual one is inside of the Academy, the art school. And you can go pay to see it, wait a couple hours. I also saw it this past May on my birthday. I've seen it on 3 different occasions. It's an amazing sculpture. It stands, you know, larger than life. You stand to about the feet because it's on this huge pedestal. Then it towers over you another 13.5 feet. There's this great story about when he finished the sculpture and unveiled it. The mayor said, you know what, I think you made David's nose too big. Would you go up there and fix it? Michelangelo's kind of pissed off. You know, he's like, I'm the artist, not the mayor. So he went up there and he goes up, climbs up the top of the ladder, and he's got his little hammer and he's got his chisel, and he knocks at the sculpture. But what the mayor and the people didn't know is he carried up some marble dust in his hand. So he went up there and he pretended to carve the nose a little bit more. And as he's doing that, he's dropping marble dust. He comes down and he looks at it. I think it's done now. Mayor says, see, I told you, you needed to make the nose smaller. Boom, now it's perfect, right? It's kind of a funny story. But it's interesting, he made the head too big on purpose, because if you're looking at this thing from below, the head's going to shrink on its own because it's the furthest thing away from you. So he made it bigger, larger than it should be. It's brilliant. Very beautiful rendering of David. Now let's compare this to Donatello's David. You can see on the left, Michelangelo's looks much more like a man, like full-grown man, like later David, like David as king. You can see the slingshot here over his shoulder. That's the only reference. You don't see any other reference to him holding a weapon or with a reference to Goliath at all. It's really interesting. Whereas here we see the sword, we see the head, we see the rock, we see the shepherd's hat. A lot of clues. He's young. This is kind of like if you read the Bible, the biblical account of David versus Goliath, he was young, right? He was a young soldier. So here, or a young shepherd as opposed to a soldier. And so here we see him more as this heroic male. So it's more of symbolism, it's stylized, it's symbolic. And it's based upon classical Greek, in this case a Roman copy of a Greek sculpture known as the spear bearer, carved by a guy named Polykleitos. Really, really similar. Look at the hand, look at the pose, the arm, the contrapposto. Even the nudity is really, really similar. And this thing right here, what is this? Well, if you notice here, they had this little piece to hold up the arm, so there wasn't this large void so it wouldn't fall off. Well, here, Michelangelo doesn't like that device, so he actually uses the hand to rest on the hip, which is a brilliant solution. And he leaves in that aesthetic of balance here with this tree. That's there. It's this classical reference. It was really, really interesting. What else is Michelangelo known for? The Sistine Chapel, right? The fresco in the Vatican. This is the center part. There are 11 different scenes from the Old Testament, God creating Adam, Noah and the flood, a lot of different scenes like that. Very colorful, very representational, naturalistic, but sculptural as well. And there's some real sculptural elements in it, and then some fake Trompe-l'oeil painted sculptural elements as well. Julius II was the Pope who commissioned this in Rome. Michelangelo's working in Florence. Julius II says, Michelangelo, come paint this ceiling for me. This is his private chapel, the Pope's private chapel in the Vatican. And Michelangelo says, no thanks. I'd rather work on sculptures. I'm a sculptor. I'm an architect. I'd rather do that shit than work on some paintings. But the Pope says, no, I demand that you come paint this. He actually put a warrant out for his arrest and sequestered him to come be in the Vatican to paint this, or else he would face punishment or repercussions. So Michelangelo does this. It takes him 4 years to paint this masterpiece in the 16th century. Beautiful painting, really amazing. Here's the centerpiece, God creating Adam, right? Kind of reaching out. Adam just sort of like limply reaching out, like, oh, I got better things to do. And God's like adamant, like reaching and stretching out. Notice the shape here. This is intentional. A lot of people didn't realize this until later, but this is a brain. This shape here, do you notice that shape? It even has, what's the word for that I'm looking for? The stem, the brain stem, braid cord here that comes out. This is the host of angels that's accompanying God as he creates Adam. And this is a little bit of a mystery who this is. Some scholars believe this is Eve, right? Adam's counterpart. But some people say it's also, because we see a baby right here, that this is foreshadowing, that this is the Virgin Mary and foretelling a prophecy of salvation through Christ. Very interesting. This is near and dear to my heart. I've been in the Sistine Chapel. I also had brain surgery, which you can see my scar here. I had brain surgery. So I wanted to have a tattoo to commemorate, this special place, my faith, the Sistine Chapel, and having brain surgery. So I have this really rad tattoo, and I got to get close so you can see it. This is God inside of the brain shape. And look at that amazing detail, very naturalistic shading. This was one of my former students that did this tattoo. I taught him at the University of Toledo. His name's Pat McDonough. So really special to me. It commemorates brain surgery and being at the Sistine Chapel. So maybe one day, if you get really good at tattoos, I'll save a spot on my arm. You can do maybe like another piece to give me like a full sleeve or something. But very near and dear to my heart, very special. Raphael is asked by the Pope to come paint his private apartment that's attached inside of the Vatican to the Sistine Chapel. So just outside the Sistine Chapel. A lot of times people think Sistine Chapel standalone church. No, it's actually in the middle of this huge big complex of buildings that are all attached by hallways. And so Raphael sees Michelangelo's painting, right? Because they're painting at the same time, 1508 to 1512. He paints this from 1510 to 1511. And this is a story about early Greek mathematicians, scientists, but there's a duality in this. This is a double portrait. We see both these classical thinkers, philosophers like Plato and Aristotle in the center. Plato is pointing to the sky because people that followers of Plato believed in the spiritual realm, the heavens, as being the most important. And here we see Aristotle pointing to the ground because people that followed Aristotle believed in the things that they can observe, science, things that they see around them. So you have these two great thinkers and one that's teaching the other. But this is also Leonardo da Vinci here. Sorry, I'm moving forward here. Boop, boop. This is Michelangelo. And he hastily added this one. This wasn't originally part of the composition because it doesn't make sense really in the space. But this is Michelangelo as Heraclitus, an ancient Greek thinker. Raphael actually paints himself over here too. This is Raphael on the far right wearing this black beret over here. So this is really interesting. We can also see, remember Masaccio, not that much time has passed since Masaccio painted the Holy Trinity in like the 1420s. Not even 100 years later, look at the accuracy and the acumen, the technique that's applied in this painting to make it look dimensional and representational. So this is in a room in the Pope's private apartment. This was called the Room of Signatures. It was part of where his library was. And these are large on the wall, and this is just outside the Sistine Chapel. So this door right here goes into one other part of the apartment. There's a door to the left that basically, goes into where the Sistine Chapel is. And there's these 4 large frescoes in the room that's about the size of our classroom, maybe a little bit larger. And you see this great sense of space here. Very, very beautiful fresco, large scale. You can see the dimensions here, about 20 by 30 feet. And this is just one of 4 in the same room. We end talking about a couple of painters that are working in Venice. So these are Venetian painters. And this is a very mysterious and enigmatic painting. We're not quite sure what it means. We have this young mother who is breastfeeding. We have this German soldier over here, this distance between them, this ruin here, Roman ruin with columns, and then you have this lightning bolt in the background. It's a poetic image. It's really curious. But one person that Giorgione taught and that finished a lot of Giorgione's paintings is the artist Titian. And this comes back into play later when we see in the 19th century Manet's painting of Olympia. He quotes this image, which is called the Venus of Urbino, which was painted for this Duke of Urbino. And it's this nude woman. It's meant to look like a Venus figure, but it was supposed to be kind of like a symbolism for their marriage. You see the dog here. Well, why a dog? Well, you think about Fido, fidelity, the man sticking with the woman. And here in the back, this is the same woman. And here she's looking for her clothes to get married. You kind of see some similarities to the Giorgione. And actually, Giorgione did a Venus as well. And so Titian is kind of copying his master here, his teacher. And so this is her reaching into this chest and finding clothes is another symbol for marriage. So this is sort of like a love aid. Like this was painted as sort of this like, oh, you have a marriage, but there's this like sexual aspect of a marriage, consummate the marriage as well. So she's like hiding her nudity, but in a way kind of revealing it at the same time. You see the flowers, also a sign of blossoming, of love. Really interesting iconography in here. The last painting that we'll look at from this first part, from part one, and I know I've been talking for a while, I just get really, really excited about this stuff. I love Italy, I love Italian culture, I love the Renaissance, I love the Northern Renaissance. Here on the left is a painter known as Jan van Eyck. So Van Eyck paints himself, and this was the style of the day to wear this sort of red turban. This was his calling card. And on the bottom, in the frame, he painted all I can. This was this famous phrase, this is all I can do. This is the best I can do. This is like Jay-Z saying greatest rapper alive. Like this is him trying to, it's like a humble brag, right? He's bragging on himself. He's saying like, this is the best I can do. That's pretty damn good. So this is a really early example of an oil painting by Van Eyck. So Northern Renaissance, think about first use of oil paint. On the right, we have this self-portrait by Dürer, and he's showing himself as Christ. You see the hand pose, the beard, the hands, and it is a way of self-fashioning as Christ. And it's really interesting because Dürer makes actually the rest of Western history think about Christ this way based on his own image. Like how influential is that? So two very braggadocious Northern Renaissance painters. Sorry, I went a little long today, part one. Friday we'll have part two. Peace out. Keep safe. Stay healthy, everyone. Signing off. And don't forget, movie review due Friday. See y'all. KIT.